It's time I'm going to bring up our second speaker of this session. It's Lindsay Graham. She is a research specialist at the Center of the Built Environment at University of California, Berkeley. She is a personality and social psychologist who specializes in the assessment of the individuals in the daily environments and person-environment fit. Today, her talk on how building occupants interpret and respond to IAQ sensor data in the context of understanding the translation into actual occupant actions. Lindsay?
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Renji. And thanks, Stuart. You've queued up my talk quite well, too. So I want to start by focusing in on the individual. So we just learned a lot about how we might intervene at a community level, as well as what those sort of broader public health impacts are. But as Stuart kept alluding to, too, there's this other component of the person that is really important when we start to consider how people may be able to respond to indoor air quality within their space. And of course, the occupant also has the power to really impact indoor air quality within the environment as well. So trying to understand how individuals think, feel, and behave with relation to the information that we can provide them is going to be really important for us to be able to shift those behavior changes in a positive way. So I wanted to start by sharing with you all some information from a large database that our research group has that's been collected from a post-occupancy evaluation survey that is one of the most widely used ones on the market today. This database represents about 90,000 respondents in close to 1,000 buildings worldwide. And what I'm showing you here is how air quality factors into the ways people perceive indoor environmental quality overall. So typically we see things such as noise issues, as well as temperature being kind of our biggest problem areas within spaces, according to occupants and how they perceive the environment. And air quality is closely behind each of those factors, which we'll talk a little bit more about that and how it relates to other aspects of indoor environmental quality here in a moment. But what's interesting is that people tend to be fairly satisfied, but somewhat dissatisfied too with this. And then when we look at how people actually report their perceptions of air quality with relation to how they think that it impacts different behaviors within their environment, we also see that it sort of has a moderate level of impact to the occupant. So another way to think about this is that people realize that air quality may be influencing them for better or for worse, but we're kind of split on how those perceptions really fall out. But interestingly, we just did another sort of deep dive into the why behind people being dissatisfied when they are dissatisfied with air quality. And as you can see, sort of the biggest sources tend to be when there's some kind of odor threshold that's crossed. And we were quite fascinated and surprised actually by this finding that food tended to be the biggest source of dissatisfaction. But as you can see here, there are other factors that we might expect, like from our furnishings, as well as the design features within the space, like our carpeting, flooring, etc. And then we also have sort of something else that I think is kind of interesting to point out is that we have this other component, meaning these other sources that individuals might be identifying that we don't capture specifically with that occupant survey. And so right now we're actually currently exploring the qualitative data alongside that to try to better understand what really those other factors might be. But in addition to this perception, what we know from other research is that oftentimes our thermal comfort and air quality perceptions are connected. So people tend to view them together. We also see this within our measurement tools like the CV occupant survey that I just shared, where from a measurement perspective, air quality and thermal comfort tend to hang together, for lack of a better way to say that. So those perceptions are tied. And specifically, this idea of positive air quality, or rather the freshness of the air, often gets conflated with components of air like temperature, airspeed, and humidity. So that's interesting. It tells us that there's a lot of factors that are going into how people are really feeling and thinking about their air. And it also tells us that this is something that's hard to detect. So from an occupant standpoint, our air quality isn't something that we can see or touch or feel without the aid of some sort of device giving us a metric or read on what that's like. But we know that, of course, our air quality has huge impacts. The last few days of this workshop, as well as today, we've been covering how that can impact our health and well-being. And of course, all of our daily behaviors and activities that we're doing within our indoor spaces are things that we are doing to thrive and survive within our environments, but they have such a large impact on our air quality that we're sort of creating this conundrum of how do we get occupants to pay attention, and how do we get occupants to understand that relationship that their behaviors have with the air quality within their environments. And then of course, you know, as we've seen in an increase, especially this past year and the preceding years too, with climate change, this also has an even stronger sort of implication for us to really meet this need of how do we educate occupants on their relationship with the environment and their relationship with indoor air. Interestingly, when we think about how we communicate information about indoor air quality, much of what we know about that communication style is actually from how we report outdoor air quality. So there's less knowledge about what we might be communicating to people about their indoor spaces. And I'm sure everyone here is also very well aware that there aren't that many devices on the market that are specifically geared towards indoor air quality for the average occupant, and less usage of those tools is also present. Of course, again, like I mentioned, in the past few years too, we see sort of an increase in people raising awareness as our outdoor spaces become more challenging. But when it comes to the average occupant as well, we don't know a ton about what the average person knows about indoor air quality, or what type of information is really engaging to them. As Stuart just pointed out, we know some aspects of what might nudge behaviors, but we're really trying to, it's still an emerging field to really understand what about indoor air quality in particular is helpful for occupants, and more specifically, what about that information that we can convey will actually motivate true behavior changes to improve our air quality as well as our health and well-being. So I want to share with you all some emerging research that we've been doing, trying to begin to tackle this at an individual level. So what we were aiming to do was try to identify what type of information occupants prefer when trying to interpret air quality, specifically indoor air quality, and what information will actually lead to accurate interpretation as well as easy interpretation of what the IAQ of a space might be. And so in order to do this, we looked at what other sorts of tools were out there, what sort of common environmental quality data visualizations existed, especially within this domain of air, and looked at what those components were across a number of a number of air quality indexes, and we generated 3 different visualizations to try to test how we might be able to whittle down what people are interpreting and how that leads to accuracy of interpretation. And we did this through a survey online. So as I said, we created 3 different visualization types using common characteristics from air quality indexes around the world. I'll dive into each of those here in just a moment and explain them in more detail. But all 3 visualizations represented the same air quality scenario, depicting a high PM 2.5 and elevated CO2 levels, basically trying to reflect something that you might see in a typical home due to cooking or cleaning. And then we presented these 3 visualizations to all of our participants, but we randomized the order in which they saw them to try to eliminate any order effects that might be present. We did this in just under 250 participants. And in addition to having them view these visualizations, we also asked them a number of questions about themselves. So we asked them about their background, things like their personality, their experiences with air quality applications on their smartphones, where they had lived through the years, specifically trying to understand if, or one question that we want to explore rather is whether or not if you're in a location that tends to have air quality events outdoors, how might that affect your perceptions? And then we also asked them a number of questions about the visualizations themselves, specifically what they preferred, their ease of interpretation, how they were perceiving the indoor air quality, and whether or not they believed action was needed in that space. And again, I'll just reiterate, it's important to remember that all 3 visualizations were actually depicting the same scenario, though occupants weren't specifically told that, or participants weren't specifically told that. And then we also asked a number of questions about their basic knowledge around pollutants that we might find indoors and experiences with products that report IAQ. So here's an example of our first visualization, what we called our numeric visualization. So this really focused on trying to just give kind of the facts of what the pollutants were, what their were, and then we also did give them some indicator of if it was good, bad, or fair within the environment. And so, for instance, if you saw this as a participant, you were told, here is a visualization that you might see on an application on your smartphone trying to depict your indoor air quality in your home. Based on this, please answer a few questions. And so again, they were asked, how easy it was to interpret, whether or not they believed the environment was healthy or had healthy air at the moment, or also if they believed they needed to take action to change the air quality within the space. So then another visualization that every participant was shown was what we called our scaled visualization. So again, we have the pollutants depicted to the occupants, and then we ranked them on a scale utilizing color coding to show whether or not the environment was good, bad, or fair, or the pollutant level rather was good, bad, or fair. And then finally, the third visualization that we generated, again, incorporated this sort of color pattern to indicate whether or not the space was good, bad, or fair. And we also here incorporated information that was specific to health effects. So which populations might be at risk, and how that might influence specific health factors, as well as what sorts of activities might be impacted that one would be doing in their home space. So after each person saw these individually, then we also asked them to compare and contrast the different visualizations to one another. And again, we were asking questions around ease of interpretation and preference. So when we started to dive into these results, we found that overall our participants preferred the visual that provided some sort of health action information towards them. But interestingly, all three visuals were easy to interpret according to the participants. So what this told us is that perhaps it's not really about the complexity of the information given and one's ability to interpret the information, but perhaps preference is actually driven by the content itself that's given. So in order to try to understand this in a deeper way, we also looked at some qualitative data that was collected alongside our scaled questions around ease and preference. And so what we saw were these sort of three broad patterns that emerged, is that occupants preferred information that was easy to understand and interpret. And as you can see here in the blue, these are just some excerpts from our qualitative data to give you an indication of what people were saying. We also found that people preferred information that was visual and graphic compared to the text-based information, and that information that was actionable was highly valued. And so in addition to looking at these likes, we also looked at the opposite and tried to understand what was it that complicated things and caused disliking of the different visuals. So as you might imagine, complexity was a big challenge, specifically when something wasn't intuitive or easy to understand. And again, like we saw reflected in our likes, when action items were not included, that also was a strike against the particular visuals. There's also a strong dislike when there was no information on the cause and effect of the pollutants. So what this is telling us too is that occupants are sort of hungry for that information to try to understand and educate themselves around why air quality may or may not be helpful to them in that moment. So what also we learned from this data was that regardless of the visualization type, if an occupant believed that the air quality was poor, they were also more likely to take action. So again, that shows us that there is this intuitive linkage between understanding that the environment is unhealthy and the need to try to move towards a healthier space. Again, indicating that there may be some motive there that we could utilize when trying to depict information like this to occupants to nudge their behaviors. And also that when people saw the health visual in particular, they were more likely to view that the environment was unhealthy. So again, kind of having that salience between how this might be affecting you as an individual and your particular health, as well as the health of others who might be occupying that space with you or who might have be considered part of a vulnerable population, that also was helpful in guiding occupants towards understanding the information in a clear-cut way. So one of the things that has been our main goal was trying to understand this particular research set of questions is that we're wanting to try to help create some sort of guidance around how we need to depict this information to the general public, especially with regards to our indoor air quality sensors. So providing information that depicts relevant health information and behavior, not just about our air quality, is really important and likely to be something that occupants can utilize. as well as providing steps for how somebody can actually overcome poor air quality. So it's not enough to just tell people that they're in an unhealthy environment. We need to guide them towards what they can do about that and empower them to make that change. And then, of course, remembering that we need clear graphical and actionable information, and remembering those likes and dislikes, specifically around those action steps taken and how cause and effect may be at play within the environment. So thinking back to these big picture sort of research needs, one of the things that I think is really, really important that we all keep emphasizing and trying to unravel is that we need to keep looking at the person themselves, because no matter how much building intervention we do, or even societal intervention, if we're not looking at the individual and their psychological drivers around their behaviors and perceptions, then we're really missing a key part to how we can implement change and create healthier spaces for people. And then with that, thinking about what other sorts of individual differences might be impacting our interpretations. So we all have different experiences, lifestyles, level of health, that can influence how we think and behave in our spaces and in the world. And then also sort of underlying identity components, such as our personality, values, motivation. There's countless studies within the psychological literature showing that these factors really influence our behavioral outcomes as well as our health outcomes, longevity of life, etc. And so we see connections between that and also how people interpret information, and how they behave with regards to components that could influence our indoor air quality. And then importantly too, do these perceptions translate into actual actions? So we know that occupants are desiring action steps and guidance on how to change their spaces, but continuing to do work at an individual level to also see what could cause this behavior change for the better. And tied to that too, what sort of things are people thinking of as they're making decisions, especially when we might have a conflicting goal? So things that we might do for our mental health, such as, setting the ambiance of a space to be relaxing. Perhaps we use candles or other sort of fragrancing devices or things like that, that obviously have a negative impact on our indoor air quality and thus our physical health, but perhaps have a positive impact on our mental health. So trying to explore more deeply, what are those trade-offs and how might we help people make well-informed decisions about them to fully support their health in a really holistic sort of way. And then, of course, thinking about what other sorts of building and behavioral interventions we might be able to do to nudge those healthy behaviors. And hopefully this workshop has continued to hammer home to all of us to the need for us to continue interdisciplinary work and working across with different experts who are all focused on tackling these challenges. And then the thing that I want to leave us all with too is just, again, coming back to that occupant and the individual. So the more that we can educate people and empower them in understanding their relationship with their space and their relationship with air quality, how their behaviors impact their lives and the lives of others, is really paramount. If without that educational piece, we don't really give occupants the potential to also help us in crafting healthy and effective spaces where we can thrive. So with that, I'll say thanks to all of you and to all of my collaborators who have worked on this work with me, as well as the Center for the Built Environment and our industry partners who supported a lot of this work.
Great, Lindsay, thanks for your presentation. And